Okay, I see some people have logged on and we will be recording this. So if anybody wasn't able to log on, you'll be able to see it later. But I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm Brandy McCula and welcome and thank you for attending. I'm a partner here at Costerisan and I specialize in that nonprofit area. Just a few housekeeping items. We are recording the webinar, so it will be available via email next week, along with on our Maynard Costerisan YouTube channel. So you'll be able to reference it there later. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please send them through the chat function, and I will be monitoring that. So we can refer to those at the end of the presentation by Emily. And also to note, we will be sending out a survey post the webinar next week. And if you have ideas for topics or anything that you might like to see during our nonprofit education series, please plug those in there. I'd be happy to see what kind of topics are that there's interest in. I won't take up too much more of your time, but I would like to hand it over to Emily Phipps with People Matters, and she can introduce herself and get started. Thank you, Emily.
Great. Thank you, Brandy. Happy to be here this morning. As Brandy mentioned, my name is Emily Phipps. I am here today representing People Matters. We are a local HR consulting group that services a lot of nonprofits and others in the local area and can really handle really anything across the HR suite. My background specifically, I have over 20 years in human resources in a variety of industries, including the energy, quite a bit of time in nonprofits, as well as retail and some manufacturing. So very happy to be here with you this morning. And I do want to let you know that following this, one of the things you will receive as part of that email is a flyer about People Matters. If you have any HR needs, whether it's related to this topic or anything in your organization, we would invite you to a 30-minute free consultation with our managing partner and owner, that's Jody Wheeling. You can also take a look at our website, People Matters, and sign up there as well. Just an opportunity to visit and talk if you have things on your mind or just want to see if there's anything that either Jody could help you with or our organization could help you with as well. For today's conversation, we are going to be talking about attracting, hiring, and in a lot of cases, even retaining employees. That has been a challenge for many organizations over the last several years, specifically with the pandemic and coming out of that. I also want to talk about a few terms you may have either read about or heard in the news and just want to explain what those are and see if those are impacting you and give you some ideas for how to address them. Those are things like you've probably maybe heard quiet quitting, quit quitting. We're dealing with productivity paranoia. And one thing I do want to mention is just boomerang employees. So we'll come around to that as well. We continue to see hiring challenges. Probably many of you on this call have seen that as well. You know, we've got labor shortages. We've had a constricted workforce for a while now. Employees or candidates have a lot of options. You know, there's so much now available both in hybrid and remote. So our local workforce has some options in other areas. Candidate expectations have changed. A lot of organizations are having trouble finding qualified candidates, candidates that really meet what they are looking for. And then we're seeing an increase in early turnover. And I do want to pause for a second and talk about that. There's this new term, or a relatively new term, that's watching this trend called quit quitting. You know, over the last decade or so, we've seen employees have more career changes, more regular than maybe a couple of decades ago, where people stayed at organizations longer. But we've seen this new development of very early turnover, and that's within the first year. And that's being a term, you may have seen it maybe on LinkedIn or other places, called quit quitting. And the challenge with quit quitting is, as you can imagine, lost productivity, increased costs. If as a hiring manager, you've just spent all that time trying to recruit and interview, you've got that time that's been invested, you know, quit quitting affects your team. You know, they've probably been, or maybe yourself, you've had some stuff added to your plate while you had the opening and you get it filled and then they leave. And so you're back to square one. So it affects your team morale. It affects your team's engagement. So we want to talk about some ways to maybe address this quit quitting idea. And hopefully you aren't seeing it, but it's out there and it's trending. And I wanted to make you aware of it. So part of the ways we address both, if you're not getting enough candidates right now because it's difficult, if you're not satisfied with the quality of your candidate pool and who you're picking from, and or if you're having to address this idea of quick quitting, I wanted to kind of take you back to the basics and encourage you that now may be a good time to review your hiring processes. You know, a lot of times hiring is one of those things, either we do it a lot recently or we haven't touched it in a while. But if you keep doing the same thing over and over and you're not getting your desired results, I would encourage you, as in most things, let's take a look at it. Take a look at it internally. Maybe if you've got an internal HR team or HR partner, or even just as a hiring manager, take a look at that hiring process. And that really starts with the job description. So go all the way back to the job description, which should correlate to your job posting, that more external facing advertisement piece, and look at that. Is it accurately representing the role? Is there language in there that is biased, you know, that really would lend itself to certain age groups or certain demographics or certain genders, right? We tend to respond differently to different verbs sometimes. So I'd encourage you, take a look at that job description. Is it in good shape? Does it reflect the role? Are there artificial barriers in it? And what I mean by that is sometimes we may look for experiences and or backgrounds and say things like, we want someone to have 7 years of experience. Well, if you're not getting a great candidate pool, I would encourage you, check all those types of things and say, you know, is this really, what would someone get in 7 years that they couldn't get in 5 years? If it's a specific skill, can you add that to the skill requirements versus just the experience requirement? So I would take a look at it. You can even pull in some of your employees or some of your peers and say, when you read this job description or these requirements, what do they say to you? And is there anything in those requirements that may be an artificial barrier to really attracting a broader or even potentially a better candidate pool? So I would encourage you to take a look at that job description as a starting point. And as you're doing so, because it's so hard right now to get those qualified candidates, you know, even take the time to make sure you and your interview team, if you've got one, we'll talk about that in a second, are really aligned on what are the priorities in the skill sets? What is actually needed day one to come in and to do it well? Are there some things that people could get on the job and or that just aren't that primary tier of skill sets needed to get that person in the door? Because what you're going to want to be doing potentially is if you can identify those core skills, those necessary skills, you'll have the opportunity to look for where can I borrow these transferable skills from? You know, that really leads us to sourcing. You know, so before you even post you get your job description, your job posting ready. And then in today's market, we're having to see, we're working with a lot of clients to really get creative in their sourcing ideas. You know, sourcing refers to where are you going to get your candidates? Are you just posting it on your website because you've always done that? Are you just posting it, you know, to LinkedIn? Are you just posting to that one place you've always posted to, but not getting the same yield in candidates? And so we're having to get creative. Where else can we go look for these qualified candidates? A couple of things I would encourage you, if you haven't tried it already, talk to your current employees, not only for referrals, but hey, where do you think, where would someone with these skill sets, what organizations, what other companies are in town, where do you think we could find people with this type of skill set? And talk about to them, you know, where might we find some transferable skills? I would encourage you, you know, build some partnerships, look out in the area and see, you know, are there any organizations or agencies that have member lists or have people tied to them? You know, depending on your organization, can you build a partnership with a local school, whether that's a local high school, whether that's a community college or a four-year college? You know, building relationships, not only with career services, but with specific departments. You know, whether that's, you know, in some cases that could be an engineering or an accounting or any kind of thing like that. You know, is there opportunity to build a relationship with a professor or a department head that says, hey, do you have any great candidates? So really start to think outside the box when it comes to sourcing ideas. You can, you know, look for referrals, ask your employees. There's some organizations that, you know, give bonuses like that, mixed results on that, but go ahead and think, you know, if you're not getting what you need, we need to start looking outside of what we've traditionally done. The other thing I would encourage you that we're seeing an uptick in is, are there other ways to meet the staffing need? meaning you may have heard the phrase gig worker. You may have been a gig worker in the past, and that has to do with someone who can just plug a hole for a while. Maybe it's for a defined project. Maybe it's for a defined role for a specific time. Also you may find yourself in a position of building a relationship with an employment agency that can provide certain types of people for certain projects, certain time of the year, for those of you that may have like cyclical types of work. So just look, right now is a time not to think outside the box and maybe not just follow the traditional hiring and staffing types of processes. The other thing I would encourage you, I know many of you are nonprofits, but it is important to have a regular point of view on compensation. Have you done a market analysis? That doesn't mean, depending on your budgets and your scenario, that you may be able to change your pay range, but at least it would give you an opportunity to know where are like positions being priced and what are people being paid. It gives you a data point. So if you haven't done a market analysis in a while, I would absolutely recommend doing one of those. Even if, like I said, even if you can't change the pay range, many of you are competing with for-profit for this, for your talent. So it's good to have an updated point of view on compensation. And then in that same vein, we're just talking about the process. How do we improve our opportunity to land good quality candidates? Your interview itself is your primary screening tool often when it comes to hiring new, fresh talent. So take a look at your interviewing process. Right now I've had a number of people I've had conversations with, we're so happy to get some candidates. We're kind of rushing through it. Maybe we're not being as objective as we would have been if we had a really robust pool of candidates. And I understand in some cases you're like, I'll take anyone. But don't shortchange yourself or your team. And let's take a look and really think thoughtfully about that interviewing process, because like I mentioned, it is one of your primary screening tools. So we do recommend multiple contacts, whether that's through a phone screening, some email exchange, interviewing with your hiring manager, maybe an additional person or a few people, just so that you've got more than one contact with the individual and have multiple points of view. Part of what I would encourage, and this has to do with that quitting, it also has to do with just fairness to the employee. A lot of organizations are so desperate that maybe they're selling a less than realistic preview to that job. And so that's leading into some of this quitting, right? We've got some unaligned expectations. Maybe we're selling some of the really exciting parts of the role, but not really emphasizing, what does day-to-day really look like? And so it can create some frustration and some misaligned ideas. So I would please do not truncate that section of the interview process. It is also an opportunity for that employee, that candidate, to get to know you, to get to know the role, to get to know what you are about and what they should expect, because we want to make a good hire where you're not turning around and just a few weeks later or a few months later having to refill that role because there were misaligned expectations. And then from an interviewing and hiring process, we do also highly recommend you have a standardized process for when you're going through that position, right? You're walking through for this particular opening. These are the questions. This is the process. These are the people they're going to meet with, so that at the end of the day, you can have a standard comparison of apples to apples because you follow the same process for filling that specific position. And then with that, once you do finally get someone, this is the often overlooked piece of the hiring process right now, and that is onboarding. And onboarding starts as soon as the hiring decision and offer is accepted. A lot of folks think, oh, finally, we'll get someone in, they'll start in 2 weeks. But, employees, more specifically candidates, have a lot of options right now. And there's a good chance they might not have just been talking to you in this interviewing process. So you want to have a communication plan between the day of offer acceptance as the hiring manager and the day they start. That may be just touch and base. Hey, do you have questions? Here's some things you can expect on the first day. If you've got company swag, a coffee cup, a pen, anything like that, we would encourage you to send it to them, because you don't want to go through all this effort, finally hire someone only to have them never start. So think about onboarding starting and that employee engagement. That's what this is about, that employee engagement starting with the day of offer acceptance all the way through that onboarding process. So when I talk about onboarding, what I'm really specifically speaking to is having a plan for how you're going to get them productive and also embedded into your team and really get that engagement off on the right foot. Good onboarding will help you get that person productive. Good onboarding will help you avoid performance management issues later down the road, and it'll help build that cohesion on your team. So you want to take the time, once again, as the hiring manager, you want to take the time to make sure you've put together a good timeline and a good roadmap for them. And that means things that could be your trainings, that could be getting them. I mean, there is the technical logistical pieces of getting all the systems set up, getting all the paperwork filled out. Those important things that you need to do early on. You want to get them acclimated to what is our total organization about? What is our department about? What is your role about? So you see these concentric circles of onboarding. But this is something where you want to be very engaged and intentional. You want to be setting up regular meetings. And one thing about onboarding, a lot of times we think, oh, let's get it all in their first week. Let's get it all in their 2 weeks. Well, I'd encourage you, think back to when you were new. How hard is that? You're kind of drinking from a fire hose, right? So you want to spread out onboarding. You want to give them a little bit, come back, check in, say, how's it going? And this is really one of the most important things you can do as a supervisor. And this addresses so many issues we'll talk about in a second, is establishing those regular meetings with your employee early on. Because what you want to catch is, hey, does this align with your expectations? Where are we missing? Where can we connect and make sure we're on the same page? How is it going? What's on your mind? This will both help people get engaged quickly, but if you do have any risk of that quick quitting because maybe expectations aren't aligned or they just don't know what's coming, I sometimes say, our new employees don't know what's coming around the bend. And so if you're having these conversations, sometimes you can help eliminate fears and help them know what's coming next just because they don't have that viewpoint. So establishing early that regular cadence of getting together and talking and telling them, giving them feedback and letting them know what's coming is so important to this hiring process. It's not just getting someone to sign the dotted line. It's not just getting them in the door. It's helping them get acclimated and letting them know that you are for them and you're going to help them be successful in their new role. What this also has to do with, though, and let me pause here, you may have heard the phrase quiet quitting. Quiet quitting is the term that was coined that really has to do with employees reducing the amount of effort they're giving to their job. Now, in general, what that means is they're still doing the things on their job descriptions, their core task, what they are expected to do. But what they're not doing is giving you the discretionary effort. Many of you have probably been in the chair or in the seat before where maybe there's a vacancy, so you took on more, or maybe there's a new project, and so your plate started to fill up, and you are very willing to give that discretionary effort, at least for some time. What we're seeing now is employees are this phrase that you've probably read about called quiet quitting, and that is where employees are reducing the amount of their discretionary effort they're willing to give their employer. Same thing is recommended here, because remember, retaining your employees is just as valuable right now, especially your good employees in this tight hiring market, as finding those new employees. So regular conversation, getting together and saying, hey, what's going well? What's not going well? We highly recommend the question, hey, what's on your mind? All right. And then follow that up again. And what else? Because what you're trying to do is to engage your employees, find out where their frustrations are. You want to celebrate them. What is going well? What else would they like to be doing? One of the best ways to engage employees is engaging them in process and making sure if there is something they want to do, you're giving them those opportunities. So establishing some cadence of regular meetings will help with this idea and this phenomenon of quiet quitting. And it may be, you're having to say, hey, I know we've had a lot on your plate. I know it's been extra. Here's where we are in the hiring process. We're trying, and so just really keeping those lines of communication open because maybe you do need another headcount. Maybe you've had to restrict through COVID or through other things. And maybe it's time, if you're having these conversations, at least they know that there's something going on in that area. So there's regular meetings that also, it shows your concern. It shows, and it will uncover issues. It will help you eliminate those barriers should they be there. But with that, if employees are giving you discretionary effort, I would encourage you to walk out of this meeting today and go thank them. Show them you see it. Show them you appreciate that effort. We can never tell our employees thank you enough, especially right now when we know that they've got options. And there may be people reaching out to your good employees, trying to woo them away from you. So make sure that you're regularly meeting with them, you're engaging them, and then you're showing them that appreciation. And that leads us to really talking about who you've currently got. There's this other phrase that's out there called productivity paranoia. And this has to do with a lot of the remote and the hybrid, where right now there's a lot of supervisors. There's this trend of supervisors saying, like, I don't think my employees are productive, where at the same time, the employee thinks they are being productive. And not only that, they're on the verge of burnout. Once again, this is something where there needs to be those regular conversations. You're establishing expectations, goals, and objectives, but you're also uncovering frustrations. Because we want you to retain your employees, not only retain them, but in some cases, you may not be able to find what you need on the market. So you may need to upskill them, or maybe you have to reskill them. Or in general, engagement, we want to develop our employees to continue to, one, it shows we're invested in them. Development doesn't have to be something super fancy, but we do encourage that every person in your organization, top to bottom, have some level of individual development plan. Things that they may be interested in. Are you talking to them about their career interests? Are you giving them opportunities? But development is also so beneficial to your organization should you start to lose people, right? Because the grass was greener somewhere else, or at least they thought so. So take development as the opportunity to cross-train, get some cross-functional and shadowing going. A, employees are getting to learn new things that makes them more valuable, but B, then you also have some coverage on the back end. With that, as we think about development, and as you think about putting together individual development plans, allowing employees to try new things, lead teams, one thing that's great for development and also good for an organization, plus engagement, is continuous improvement, right? That sounds like a big fancy word, but a lot of times it's saying like, hey, is there any process? Is there anything we could be doing better, differently? Is there work that can be eliminated? You've probably all had the experience of, why do we do it this way? We've done it. What is this getting to us? Is there a better way? So inviting your employees into that conversation develops them, gives them ownership. Then you can put together little cross-functional teams if you want to, or just a little task force, or you say, hey, Emily, would you go lead this for us? Would you put together a plan and a proposal, or would you give us just a recommendation? It doesn't have to be fancy. But that's another way to develop your current team, to show them that what they think, and they're a valuable part because they're improving the organization. So you're kind of hitting a few things at the same time. So development, do not neglect development right now. Employees do have options. It's a great way to not only improve your staff, but also just let them know they care. Which brings me to one final term. I know we're short on time. I wanted to mention to you, and that's a boomerang employee. Being in HR for years now, in the past, what that refers to is an employee that once worked for you, went away, and now maybe they're back. They've boomeranged back to you. A while back, there was kind of a negative connotation around that. There was a loyalty issue. They left. Well, I just want to encourage you right now to maybe rethink that mindset. And one of the reasons being, there's so many voices out there competing for employees that we all sometimes think, well, maybe the grass is greener over there. Well, we've also probably all experienced that the grass isn't always greener in a new scenario. So one of the things you can do as a great manager, as a great supervisor, is if you've had a good employee that has left your organization, keep in touch with them. They may not offer, they may not be like, hey, can I come back? But keep in touch with those good employees. They may be great employees again in the future. Those employees would come back. There'd be less time to productivity. They would know the organization. Maybe they would come back to a different role, but just, reach out occasionally. Hey, how's your new role working out for you? Even if it's working out great and you still have an opening, hey, do you know anyone that they are continuing to expand their network? So they may have some ideas for you. So for those of you that in the past that maybe have written off the idea of ever having an employee come back, if they were a good employee, it's easy now with things like LinkedIn. We've got cell phones, we can text. check in and say, hey, how's it going over there? We still have this opening. If you want to come back, we loved having you. We'd love to have you come back. But I just wanted to just throw that out there as another source, and keep that in mind as well.
Awesome, Emily. Great information. There's so many organizations and type of industries that are affected by a lot of this recruiting and keeping employees. I know that we at Maynard, the last term that you talked about boomerangs, we've seen a lot of boomerangs. I was a boomerang a long time ago, but we recently, we've had a lot of people come back after being gone for a different amount of time. We do have a couple questions, so I wanted to start with the one in the chat. Question is, do you see more organizations utilizing specific recruiters instead of the traditional platforms like Indeed or the things online?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's really mixed right now. And some of it depends on the specialty and the budget. I will tell you, people have probably been a little bit quicker to move to recruiters, mainly out of a lot of frustrations. A lot of people have had openings for a long time and they've had trouble filling those. So out of, I don't want to use the word desperation, because they're looking for someone who can do it full time. If you don't have HR staff, and if trying to do this recruiting and sourcing is something you're doing off the edge of your desk, I would say, look at that cost benefit ratio, look at that and say, it might cost me a little bit, but the time savings to get to a better product quicker may be worth it in the long run. So I wouldn't say overall full scale swing to recruiters, but I do think it's a more viable option than it may have been, 5-6 years ago. People are turning to it a little quicker, just out of a time and a cost benefit.
Great, thank you. Also, earlier you had mentioned, you kind of talked a little bit about the interview process and, what you recommend. But for someone who's typically, do you recommend like a panel type of interview, or what kind of things do you recommend in that hiring process?
Sure, absolutely. Great question. So there's a few things I would recommend. Yes, in general, whether it's panel altogether or multiple contacts, yes, I would recommend you have more than one person involved. But even before you get the panel involved, we're really big on understanding the priorities of what you need out of that person, making sure you're asking those questions. But also behavioral-based questions. Tell me about a time, Brandy, where you had a really difficult customer service scenario. You had an irate customer. How did you resolve that issue? Yeah, what was your specific role? What would you have done differently? One of the reasons we like behavioral-based interviewing is not just for that question, tell me about a time, but what did you learn and what would you do differently? Because a lot of times what we need from our employees is a base platform of skill, but we need people who are adaptable, right? Flexible. In this new environment of work where there's so much changes so quickly, we need people who are capable of learning, which is one of the reasons I also love continuous improvement, is because you're creating problem solvers. So if you can find out through the interview panelists, maybe they haven't had the exact experience, but they're aware, they're cognizant, they're willing to learn and adjust. So we do recommend using behavioral-based interview questions. We recommend following up, don't just leave it at once and done. So many people want to truncate it, right? It's so hard. It's so painful. You've got so many other things to do, but have that follow-up conversation and make sure you're giving enough time for that employee to ask, or that candidate to ask you questions, and maybe even involve someone who is in that role, not necessarily, from a standpoint of they're interviewing the person, but hey, let me tell you what a day in a life really looks like, because it's maybe different coming from me as a peer than, someone who's a supervisor that's saying, hey, this is what you would do. So they may not be an interviewer, but just like, hey, let me give you a realistic view, and then come back and talk to me again. That's so important right now to make sure we're not having people jump really quickly because we've sold them. A lot of people say we've sold them the sexy, exciting piece of it, but we haven't sold them the day in and day out regularity.
Yeah, thank you. I know that I've made the mistake in interviews where I personally will talk too much trying to sell my side and then don't leave much time for questions. And then I find out they have way more questions than I have time for. So I've learned that along the way also. I feel like
think 70-30, they should be doing percent of that talking. You want to and you want to close it, but you really want to get a lot out of them in the middle.
I'd like to squeeze one more question in. So we have 1 more minute or so. You mentioned a lot about meeting regularly for employee engagement. how would an organization start doing that if they've never really done that before?
Sure. That's a great question, because a lot of times if you're the supervisor, you may come forth and say, hey, I want to start meeting regularly. And immediately there's fear, like, oh, what did I do wrong? Are we managing my performance? And so I would outline very clearly, here's what I want to do. I want to do this so that you've got the opportunity to express what you're thinking about. You can bring forth ideas. We can be aligned on and really just level setting on what are the goals. If you're concerned, another way to do it would be to start with a group meeting, like that continue, start, stop, and do it as a group. What should we continue doing? Start, stop, start doing, stop doing, and then say from here on, I'd like to meet individually so that, I can hear what's going on. And as a supervisor, you're there to support them. I want to eliminate any barriers. I want to make sure we're aligned on priorities, because how often have we been frustrated because we're doing X and we really needed to do Y first, right? So I want to align with you on priorities. So I'd encourage you just to be transparent in, I want to be a better help. I want to be with you. I want to be for you. And I want to allow you to have that access to me as well.
Great, thank you. Well, I wanted to thank you, Emily, for joining us today. Such great information, and thank all of the attendees for attending today. And you will get some follow-up, as I mentioned, next week. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to Emily or myself, and we'd be happy to answer those after the fact if you have any questions. Appreciate you coming today.
Thank you, Brandy.
Thank you.